Yes. Good morning this morning. How's everybody this morning? Good to see you. Good to have you with us this morning, Margaret Street Church of Christ. Beautiful day outside, beautiful time inside, and so we're glad to have you here. This particular class, this is the last Sunday of the quarter, and so we're going to continue and finish up with what Scott started with missions. Scott had his plan that he went through, and actually went longer than we first thought, because they wound up being here longer because of the visa, which, by the way, they have. So congratulations, and we're excited for them and thankful that all that's working out. They got their visa to be able to go to Italy. It came in the mail. Yeah, it came in the mail, and so everything's coming together. The plan, don't you love it when a plan comes together? So we're continuing in this class with one more class on missions. Last week we started talking about culture shock. Week before that, Scott had talked about culture and some of the things involved in missions, and he mentioned culture shock and just a few things about it. And so in this class, last week we gave more details about that and still weren't able to finish. That's how much there is to it. And Scott and I were talking, and he obviously could teach this class just as easily as I could, because he's experienced this and knows these things as well. But the approach that I want to take in this is we need to take care of our missionaries. And so it's important for us to understand as a congregation what our missionaries are going through. And so this way it's easier to say we need to take care of Scott, instead of Scott standing up here saying y'all need to take care of me. And that's kind of the idea behind that. So when we're talking about culture shock, we went through a whole lot of things last week of what this entails, and I'll touch on some of those, but just to get us started so that everybody understands what we're talking about. It is the feeling of disorientation experienced by someone who is suddenly subjected to an unfamiliar culture, a way of life, or a set of attitudes. Now, we've talked about in this class that it can be even moving from the north to the south, or from, actually, I've experienced it a little bit coming from Texas to Florida to South Florida. I walk down the street with my cowboy boots on and my cowboy hat, howdy, 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 and nobody speak back to me. And so there's a culture shock right there for me. But it can happen in many different ways, and certainly if you're going to another country. And again, the reason why, let me skip on through these. This was last week. Let me get on up to where I want to be here. Talking about language, and I'll touch on all these. This is part 2, feeling that disorientation. But why is understanding culture shock important for us? And as far as I know, John doesn't have any plans to go into the mission field and experience all these sort of things, right? And many of us do not. So why do we need to know this? It's something that just Scott and Rebecca need to know about, because they're about to experience this. Even though they've been in the mission field before, they're going to a new culture, and they will experience culture shock. I tell you this time, the second time around won't be near as intense. Really, kind of the third time around for them, because they first went to Pompeii, then they came back to the States, and then a little bit in Ireland, and now going to Italy. But here's the reason why. Evangelism. We are sending out missionaries. Why? To fulfill the Great Commission, to do our part as senders of sending out our missionaries. So we need to take care of our missionaries and understand these things. That's the main reason. So for care for our missionaries. Now, we talked about last week that there is really what it's called as an acculturation process. You call it culture shock. That's really a misnomer. It's actually culture stress. Cultural stress is what it boils down to, because it's not just something, when you think of shock, it's something that happens quickly and then you're over it. But in this case, this is ongoing. And actually it has several phases, and depending on which missiologist you talk to, these phases could be 3, which is what I prefer. This is called the glamour or honeymoon stage, the rejection stage, and then the identification stage. And we'll talk about what those are in just one second. Some of them call it the honeymoon, the crisis, recovery, and adjustment. Others call it the honeymoon, distress, reintegration, autonomy, independence stage. They delineate them in different ways. They're all the same thing, essentially, but the reason it's important for us to know this is we need to know what our missionaries are going through, And we're going to touch on this more towards the end of the class of how we can support them as they go through this and how to avoid some of these things so they can be more effective. So we talked about the honeymoon stage. That's pretty simple. I think you can figure that out. This is kind of the same feeling as you might have as a tourist, where you're excited about everything and you want to see it, and you kind of glamorize the host culture, and everything is neat and unique and quaint or beautiful or different, and it's just all this wonderment and this excitement. And some people might build this up more in their head than the culture really is. And then what winds up happening is, whenever the honeymoon stage wears off, and it will, usually the first sign of that is whenever you realize, I don't have a ticket home. I'm here. This is not a 2 or 3 week vacation. I'm here now for a while. And that's when things start to realize. And the bigger you have built up the culture, the harder the fall, if you will, or the bigger the gap is that leads into this rejection stage. Because if you have built it up really high, what was once quaint and neat and beautiful now becomes repulsive and even aggravating. And so it just depends on how much you build that culture up that leads into this. And almost every missionary, military, different people that spend time overseas goes through this. And they get to this stage, and this is the actual culture shock stage, if you will, or culture stress. And what happens is people start feeling they start feeling the anxiety. We talked about last week how really this is a mental health issue. And I'm not saying that they're psychotic or anything, but mental health has to do with well-being and how one feels and their identity. When you lose cultural cues and things like that, we talked about last week, where you no longer know what to say, where to go, what to do, or how to do it, then all of a sudden the confusion comes in and the culture shock starts. And this is where you start winding up with bewilderment, paranoia, homesickness, depression, sadness, anger, hostility, sleep deprivation. So you can see this is serious business when you start getting into this. Now, when this process starts, and this can all lead to exhaustion, by the way, that if you're constantly under stress, and a missionary will go through this as they're learning a language, learning a culture, trying to adapt, it's going to be constant stress. And what winds up happening is they go into these basically 3 negative responses within this rejection stage, or the actual cultural shock. The first one is returning home, the second one is withdrawal, and the third one is going native. Now, what happens is, typically, this happens from a lack of preparation, perhaps going into the mission field for the wrong motive. You know, some people go into the mission field for lots of different motives that aren't as straightforward or pure as they should be. And also, most likely, unrealistic expectations. That's a lot of times what builds this up. So returning home, a lot of times when a missionary, once the honeymoon stage wears off, they may have this feeling of feeling unprepared, inadequate, or just simply overwhelmed. They might even feel deceived. I got to tell you, I felt that way when I got to Paraguay. Once everything kind of settled down, I felt kind of deceived because I felt like my teammates, the ones who'd been there before me, hadn't given me all the information I needed before I got into the field. And unfortunately, anger came out. And so this is what winds up happening is, as a result, the first reaction may be, I want to go home. I didn't sign up for this. And as I said last week, the first thing we need to understand is that nobody, certainly a missionary, no one should be made to feel guilty or ashamed if they do want to come home. If you send a missionary over in the field and he's there for the first, say, 3, 4, 5 months, whatever it is, and then you get a call that says, you know what, this is not going to work, and they want to come home. Yeah, it's sad because we've lost a missionary in the field, but they should not be made to feel ashamed or guilty for that reason. Why? Because stewardship. If we force them, or if they force themselves to stay over there, what are they going to do? Are they going to be as effective in evangelizing? No, they're not. In fact, we're going to basically not be good stewards of the Lord's money by continuing to send money over there if they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing. There's all kinds of other things that can develop out of that. And it's actually fairly common for missionaries to spend the first 6 months in the mission field trying to figure out a way back home. It's just part of your natural thinking. I went through that myself, thinking, "Wow, do I really want to do this?" And you work. These are all part of having to work these things out. Now we call this a negative thing because of missionary being lost in the field, but again, this is one of those responses. The other one that happens, and this is really the one that's most common, is withdrawal. So the honeymoon stage wears off, and they don't really know how to process these feelings. They don't know what's happening. So basically they withdraw, they retreat back into a safe haven. They create a kind of a buffer zone between them and the host culture. And usually it's because they feel overly challenged, like they're having difficulty learning the language. They can't quite figure out what the culture is. And so, hey, I'm here. I signed up for this. I'm going to get through this. And what they wind up doing is they wind up immersing themselves in things like logistic or administration type duties and just kind of separate themselves from the host culture. This is very common. In fact, the team before me, one of the young ladies that went with them, there was, I'll show you a picture of them here in just a few minutes, but one of the young ladies went with them. She just couldn't handle it, and so she just stayed in her house, came to the office to work admin, went back home, and she would tell you that. I'm just here to do this work. Now, what often happens, they'll wind up criticizing the host culture and making themselves out to be more superior than the host culture, and not really trying to learn the language or trying to, they just kind of separate. You actually see that a lot, believe it or not, with embassy personnel. There in Paraguay and some other places that we've been, we noticed, because they're there just for 2 or 3 years, and they have a compound that they live on. It's very American. They get to go out and just kind of experience the culture in little bits, but then they're right back in their American society. And they're very critical of the host culture a lot of times. And we noticed that with a lot of the friends that we made in the embassy. And so this is part of this withdrawal. Now, people also become very angry, anxious, depressed during this time by separating themselves in various ways of separating from the host culture. And so you can see where this can cause a problem, again, with evangelism and missions. Now, the other extreme opposite of that is called going native. This is just the opposite. So instead of separating yourself, you completely immerse yourself. Next thing you know, you see the person, they're dressing exactly like the host culture. They're using the same lingo, eating all the same foods. You maybe even go find a place to live just like it. Saw this in Paraguay just as well with one of our missionary teammates. And unfortunately, what winds up happening in this is they try to adopt the new culture, but the host culture is not dumb or not ignorant to these things, and they just look at this missionary and go, you could leave anytime you want. You're not bound here. This is not where you grew up and you can't leave. Some people can't leave their culture. And so they see him really as a phony. They don't really see him as real. We know that, for example, we were told when we moved to Paraguay, don't go try to live like the natives. You're going to see, when I say native, I mean native to that country. Don't try to live like them, because some of them live in block houses with no doors and things like that. They said because they know that you don't come from that. Okay, it would be like, I'm just making this up. You think of a Saudi Arabian prince, right? Those are some of the most wealthiest people in the world, extreme wealth. If the Saudi Arabian prince were to come here and then try to live in some meager little house or drive a jalopy or something like that, we would know it was, and we knew who he was and where he came from. We would know he was a phony, or it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't match up. And really, you can hinder yourself in evangelism because people won't see it as genuine. And people like that, they smile all the time. It's so good to see you, and they just and you think that's fake. Well, it's the same way even in this going native idea of immersing yourself. So what happens? These two different things. In the withdrawal, you have someone who's rejected the host culture and glamorized their own culture, so it's more psychological than physical. With going native, it's somebody who rejects their own culture and glamorizes the host culture so it's more physical than psychological. Now, these are real things. Like I said, I've seen it even within my own teammates. Not to the full extreme that it can be, but these are some of the negative responses that come with this. Now, why is all this important? Because it affects evangelism. And in our case, it affects team dynamics. I want you to think about that. Whenever you have a team who's there to do mission work, it can create all kinds of stress and issues within that team. It can spill over into the church. The church will pick up and sense those sort of things if there's any kind of disconnect or problems with the mission team. This also can lead to stress within the missionary's marriage and other relationships. So if one of the spouses, if one of the partners in the marriage is doing fine with cultural stress and the other one can't handle it and goes native or withdraws, it's going to cause some stress within that family. And so hopefully you're starting to see why it's important for us to know a little bit about this so that we can help our missionaries and recognize this. Because it can lead to, loss of funding, creating more stress, jealousy, competition, envy, unrealistic expectations. That's a big one. It's the unrealistic expectations and all kinds of emotions that winds up hindering the functionality of the team. Everyone responds differently to cultural stress, but it can greatly encumber the work if we don't identify it. Yes, Scott?
Well, first of all, that everything you said, I could have, if you assigned me this, I could have said it, I would have said it word for word because we've experienced all these things and seen them all. But just that last thing you mentioned about problems with the teams and problems with the missionaries, without trying to be overly judgmental or overly generalized, missionaries are some of, in my opinion, some of the most jealous people I've ever been around in my life. I think I've told you this expression before, that missionaries are often like cow manure. If you spread them out, they do a lot of good. If you pile them up, they stink. But when we have just yesterday, we were interacting with somebody that has been in the Pacific Islands for 14 years, and we were there 12 years. And Rebecca was communicating with her. She sent her this message about how you learn so much when you've been in the islands for 14 years. And then she said, or in 12 years, winky face, like I've outdone you because I've been here 2 years longer. And we dealt with that all. And we probably did some of that ourselves. I don't want to act like I'm perfect here, but you get these, where I live, the power goes out 6 hours a day. Oh,
Yeah.
where I live, it's 8 hours a day.
I suffer more than you suffer. So.
Right. It's a real big problem. So when you add that in a team with cultural stress, and then, I've learned the language better than you have or something,
Yeah.
it's really problematic.
In fact, you led right into the next thing I was going to say is that there is, down in South America, a lot of us missionaries in South America all know each other. And the reason being is because there's a group that works with all of the different missionaries. And this one missionary from Brazil who helps establish teams told me one time that he doesn't know of a single team in all the 30, 40 years he's been involved in planning churches and mission teams in South America that hasn't had problems. That every mission team had problems. And a lot of times what winds up happening is it winds up encumbering the work. Now, there are also professional counselors in South America that travel around to the different teams. We had a counselor come through to us, and I remember the first time whenever Chris, one of my teammates, said, "Hey, we got the Continent Care counselors coming in here next month," and I'm thinking, counselors? Well, looking back, that the fact that they are such high demand tells you something. Also in South America, they have a thing, and I've reported on this in the past, called Continent Care Connection. And what it is, it's a retreat in October. They have one year for men, the next year for women, and missionaries from all over South America come together, and the whole purpose is for us to reconnect with other missionaries, but mainly they bring in this whole team of counselors, every kind of counselor you can possibly think of. And so if you're getting ready to go back to the States, they'll counsel you on that. If you're having marriage issues, they'll counsel you on that. If you're having team issues, whatever your issue is, there's people there, or there's all kinds of different things that are designed to help you talk these things through, identify cultural stress, your first time on the field. The fact that that even exists tells us that this is a serious issue. The fact that something like that even exists shows you that we're talking serious business here, and it's why we need to know these things. Now, I mentioned up here, all these things apply to reverse culture shock. What's reverse culture shock? Coming back to the States. Once you've been gone for a long time and you come back to the States, same thing. You have this honeymoon stage. You idealize how you think it. I remember how it used to be. Oh, they had all these great things. I'm going to do this. And you get back, America has changed. It is not the same. In fact, when Andrew and I went into the mission field, there weren't anything as smartphones. You know, we come back, next thing you know, everybody's got a smartphone. Me and Andrew, I think, were the last people in all of South America to own a smartphone. Because we kept missing all the messages and everything. We finally had to get on board. But this is minimized. All of this can be minimized by simply working through and understanding what it is that what the problem is. I kind of got three thoughts going on in my head right there. Sorry. All this can be minimized by recognizing it, studying it, and helping our missionaries with that. So this identification stage, say this real quick, Joe, and I'll get right to you. So that leads then into what's called the identification stage. Once somebody finally works out all these problems that they're having and starts to realize, okay, this isn't so bad, I can do this, and they've worked through all that, then they wind up in what's called the identification stage, sometimes called the acculturation or independent stage. And this is the stage where they finally begin to work out that emotional crisis, and culture shock is less debilitating. A lot of times it happens from just learning the language. Yes, Joe? Exactly. But well, the thing about going native, you have to remember, it's the extreme. You're taking it to the extreme. If I go to Papua New Guinea as a missionary, and everybody there knows I'm an American, but the next thing you know, I'm wearing a loincloth and putting feathers in my hair and living in a tree house, you know, that is not American, and they know that. So Paul wouldn't have done that. Paul might have lived in a tree house, but I don't think he would have worn a loincloth and put feathers in his hair. He would have still continued to wear the clothes that he did and speak the way he did, but he would learn, hey, look, I am living among the people. Andrew and I lived among the people in a house very similar to what it's kind of median of what Paraguayans live in. So yes, we could reach them. And so becoming all things to all men, you've got to be careful with that. That simply means I'm adjusting to their culture. I'm going and sitting where they're sitting. So coming back to the identification stage, when you finally learn the language, that seems to be the biggest thing. Because once you learn the language, then all of a sudden, it's the weirdest phenomenon I've ever experienced in my life. It's just like all of a sudden you just realize, hey, I just understood what they said. I just understood what they said. And what's really strange about it is you think they're speaking English. And then you realize, no, that was in Spanish. Andrea experienced it that way on a television show. I experienced it one time on radio. I remember just sitting there listening, and I understood every word that came across the radio, and I went, wow. Once that happens, then all of a sudden doors start to open up, and you don't feel so constrained and stressed and confined. Then when you learn the cultural cues, and you start adapting those cultural cues by habit. So when you walk in, for example, like we do in Paraguay, and immediately, hand on the right shoulder, dos besos, and you just go around. You don't even think about it. You're starting to adapt, and all of a sudden, all the cultural stress goes away. Another thing that happens is stimulation overload or sensory overload. A lot of people that came down told us after about 4 days, their head was spinning because of all the language and the signs and the traffic, and there's movement and everything. And after you've been there, all of a sudden, all that just kind of goes away. You don't really notice it. And you think, what are you talking about? I didn't even notice it. Because your mind begins to adapt. This is that identification stage. There's all kinds of things that happens, and what happens in this is actually the missionary becomes what's known as a third culture Christian. They are no longer 100% American. They've lost some of that because now they've adopted another culture, and when you put those two together, they don't really fit in this culture, and they no longer fit in this culture anymore. They become what's called third culture Christians, and this is a real problem with missionary children. No. Well, you can have a nervous breakdown, but once you get to this stage, you're good. It really affects our children because, missionaries' children, because they're the ones that they come back, for example, they were born in America, they knew American things, they go to Africa, they learn African things, they come back to America to go to college or something, and they see with their friends that they're making, they see their friends are so materialistic and all kinds of little things like that, and they can't even identify with that. And then their friends think they're weird because, what do you mean you don't want that? You see, you start having these disconnects, and the poor kids, when I say kids, I'm talking about teenagers up into about 30, in that age range, whenever they're coming back and forth, it is difficult for third culture Christians. Now, all of this is to get us to this point of what we should do, Margaret Street, helping our missionaries and understanding what they're going through. One of the first things, now we're not going to do this with Scott and Rebecca because they've already been in the mission field and we have a pretty good idea what their emotional assessment is. They've pretty much put that on display whenever they were there. But a brand new missionary who's about to go in the field, Andrew and I went through this, is an emotional assessment. And what that means is psychological examination. Now, nobody wants to be psychologically, they think they know themselves. I know me, I know who I am, I know what I can do, I know what I can't do. Let me tell you something, no you don't. You don't know yourself as well as you think you do. Because a lot of times, depending on the testing that you do, personality testing, things will come out that you're like, oh yeah, that's right, I do that, don't I? Or, yeah, I do have a tendency to do that. Well, all it does is simply identify who you really are. And now there's a whole lot more to it than that. It can also identify some other issues, but the biggest thing it can identify is, are you really adapt to go into the mission field? The team before us, the founder of the team, the one in Freed Hardeman, who said, hey guys, let's get a team together and let's go into the mission field. This is Chris Fry and his group and everything. Their leader, I won't mention their name, but their leader, the one who put this thing together, once they got everything rolling, they even went out on a few survey trips to try to figure out where they wanted to go. They went through this psychological assessment where they all went through the testing and everything, and it came out that the wife did not want to go and should not go. I've known other missionaries that the psychologist or whatever said, listen, here you're fine, but I'm afraid if you go in the mission field, you're going to have a lot of problems. I don't recommend you going into the mission field. Why? Because whatever issue you have here, however slight it is, it will be magnified 3, 4, 5, 10 times more in the mission field because of those social cues and things like that. Everything is gone. All of a sudden, all you focus on is that personality thing, and it really gets magnified. And that's why you start having culture shock. You start having problems with mission teams and things like within the mission team and things like that. Is this making sense? Some of the things that people are going through. So proper preparation is what's so important, and because we need to be good stewards. 1 Peter 4, verse 10, and we need to administer to those, or those that are administering and ministering in the mission field need to give them their best effort. 2 Timothy 4, verse 5. And so, just to be able to identify these things is important. Now, the second major thing, the second major thing on that is to gather as much information as possible on the culture. So once you get this assessment, then gathering all the information that you can about where you're going, because the more information you have, it all has to do with information. Information and communication is what will alleviate or help a person get to the identification process faster. Yes, Scott?
Sorry, but on that emotional assessment, I don't know if there's anybody here who's considering going to
That's right.
You could go someplace else, maybe.
Yeah.
So, like, for example, in Monte, it's not for everybody. But they might go to Canada or something.
Yes. Thank you. That's exactly right. Thanks for clarifying that, because I should have said that depending on where you're going, you may not be the type of person that can handle it in the African bush, you know. But you might be the person who is perfectly set up to go to Lisbon, Portugal, or something like that. So it just depends. I know this. If I would have taken Andrea to Panama first, where they have all kinds of American stores and American things and all this American stuff, she would have never gone to Paraguay. It'd have been Panama. Or after being in the mission field for 7 years, we finally made it over to Montevideo, Uruguay, fell in love with the place. Had we gone to Uruguay first, we'd have never gone to Paraguay, because same thing. It had everything that we like, and we could have adapted to that so much easier. Obviously, we adapted in Paraguay, but that would have been even a better fit. I don't know that we'd be here right now if we had gone to Uruguay. So the second thing is gathering this information. Then, of course, as we already mentioned, all of this has to do to help the missionary get from the honeymoon stage. You're going to have that honeymoon stage. Y'all excited to go to Italy? I guarantee it. You're going to have that honeymoon stage. It's going to be great the first many months. It usually doesn't last more than a year. It's usually less than a year. Then you get into the culture shock stage. The cultural stress is really a better word, not culture shock. And then to get into the identification stage, you can accelerate that by doing certain things. And first of all, top of the list is language. As one of my missionary teammates said, language to the missionary is like oil to a motor. Without it, it will not function very long. And it keeps everything running smoothly. So, what we recommend and what I've seen personally is the first year, and we as the sending congregation need to recognize this, that for the first year we should not put too much expectations on Scott and Rebecca in this case. Then just learn the language. Learn the language and learn the culture. Now, y'all know Scott, he's not going to be sitting there doing nothing but learning the language and the culture. He's going to be preaching, he's going to be teaching, he's going to do everything he can. I know it. But our expectation, and his expectation too, and Rebecca, should be just learn the language. Because without the language, you will not be effective. Working through translators does not work, folks. I know missionaries have been in the mission field for 30 years and still use translators. Now, some of them have to because they travel so many places. But if you're in the same place for 30 years, you should know the language. Because you can't get to a heart language if you're working through a translator. And so they got to learn the language and learn the culture. Now, in the meanwhile, I know that they're going to, I'm just pushing all kinds of buttons for you guys. I know they're going to be, they've already said they're going to be traveling around, seeing the other congregations, getting to know because that's one way of learning the culture, learn what it's all about. So there's learning, everything else. One more thing, Rebecca. The second year is when that will actually start coming in. A full year to learn the language. It'll be the second year before they actually start being able to put it into ministry. So 2 full years before being 100% effective. Yes, Rebecca. Oh, don't worry, we will. Yes, in reality, that was minimum, I should say. That was minimum. Exactly. And also, it depends on how you do it. For example, in our case, and I'll get right to you, Lord. In our case, we literally, 3 hours a day, 5 days a week, we did that for 1 solid year. So that we were studying in the morning, and then all afternoon, all we were doing was learning the culture. We were fully immersed into it. Now, that's intense. And then within 1 year, I still didn't feel like I was 100% adequate. It wasn't until that second year, after a complete second year of putting it in ministry, that I began to feel like, okay, now I can kind of manage, not fluent. I learned there's no such thing as fluency until way further down the line. In fact, most missionaries will tell you 5 years is what it takes to really get effective. It takes 5 years before you develop those relationships, you develop the language, you develop everything. And what did you say? It took you 4 years approximately to learn the language? And you didn't even have the tools that you had there. So here's how I define fluency. If you can go into any situation and you have enough words to get what you need. For example, if you don't know anything about cars and mechanics, but you speak English, you've lived here your whole life, what could you do if you had a problem with your car? You would walk into somebody, a mechanic or something, go, listen, there's this thingy that's broke, it's making this sound, and it's coming from the back of the car, but listen to what you're saying. You're describing those things, and they will help you. I did this walking into a hardware store. Listen, I don't know what it's called, but I need that thing that makes water move. And they go, oh, a plunger. Yeah, okay. Lori? Okay. There's a couple of things. One is missionaries have a window that they need to watch out for, and that window is if they're under about 8, if they're from about 0 to 8, they're good as far as moving anything. But once they hit about 8 years old, up into about 19, they need to stay where they're at. This is just what research has shown. Because if they move or if they change the mission field or come back or go either one, it really creates a lot of stress on that child. If they do that, if they will respect that window about, let's just say 9 to 19, then usually the child doesn't have any problems. We've got some missionaries, friends in Brazil, who the child that was there during that time frame, 9 to 19, has gone on to Harding, and they're doing just fine because they were able. They're Brazilian, but now they're becoming American. But the child that they moved during that time, they're struggling. And so they have a lot of times. In fact, Harding has a group called Third Culture Kids, and it's just to help those missionary kids. So yeah, it's a very fascinating and interesting thing. All right, so prescription for cultural stress is understanding the symptoms and knowing what to expect. And that's where Scott and Rebecca already have an advantage. They know what to expect. They will recognize these things coming up. But what we can do and what they need also is a support network. Listen, I can't tell you how much of a difference it made in Andrea's feelings and things like that to get a care package from Margaret Street. It changed her whole demeanor for an entire month. To get those Skype calls. Remember when we used to do those Skype calls and stuff like that? Or somebody just call us up on Skype or whatever and say, hey, how you doing, brother? Or a Facebook message. You know, I've been thinking about you. Tanya was real good at that, just constantly sending us messages supporting us as missionaries. We as a congregation need to do that for Scott and Rebecca this first couple of years. We need to do it all the time, but especially this first couple of years so that they have that support network. Now, put in nesting time. It's funny, she walked out right as she had to go, I know. This is important for women. And I don't want it to sound derogatory, but there is a thing called nesting time, and that is where a woman needs her space where she feels secure, she has her children taken care of, all her needs are being met, and she's able to what they call nest. All right? Again, please don't take that as derogatory, but it's a good term when you think about a mother hen who will not lay eggs if they're stressed, if they have issues or anything like that. You see the correlation there? And so you need to give them that time where they can feel comfortable, then everything else starts to come together. Yes. That's all right. Yes, I knew that. I know. See what I mean?
We moved every 4 months at least, and we just really started to get settled into our, and then we had to leave that apartment and go to another one, and then next week we'll go to Italy. So, just if you can just kind of keep that in mind when you're ever dealing with her or anything, it's been pretty close to 2 years since it's happened. So.
Ladies, could you imagine that? not living out of a suitcase, not really having a home, your home, for 2 years. Andrea only dealt with that for about 6 months at a time. 6 months going, 6 months coming, and things like that. And it was difficult. She did fine, but it's a very important thing. You see how this is important for us to understand now as a congregation, a sending congregation, to help our missionaries, just to know these things so that you know how to talk to them, what to expect from them, and things like that. Now, again, why is understanding all this important? It all comes back to evangelism. I don't have enough time to get into everything I wanted to get into, but there is a missionary named Ralph Winters that developed what's called the E3 scale. And what this is, it refers to the distance or the gap between a missionary and the hearers of the gospel. And this is why things like culture shock and us understanding these things is important. Now, what it is he basically takes E for evangelism and does a 0 through 3 scale. And EO corresponds to evangelizing people within the church. So if you know somebody within the church and they're already part of a Christian family, there's no real cultural barriers being crossed. They already know who God is, they know what the Bible is and things like that, and you're just simply evangelizing directly to them. E1 corresponds with what you read in Acts 1, verse 8, when he says, "You'll be witnesses to me first in Jerusalem, then in Judea, then in Samaria, then all of the earth." So now you're going outside of the church, outside those doors, outside the church building, and you're still within your own culture, your own language, but it's people who don't know the church. And so this is what we call evangelism, outreach, or home missions, where only one barrier is crossed, and that is you're leaving the church, as in knowing those terms and things. The next one is called E2. This is Judea and Samaria. This is where you are in the same language, but a different culture. So 2 barriers are crossed, not only going outside the church building, but now to a completely different cultural system. For example, moving from the north to the south, all right, going from, and this is within English-speaking countries, going from the country into the inner city. Suppose you go to English-speaking Canada or to New Zealand. They still speak English, but the culture is completely different. And so this is the type where you're talking to your geographical neighbors, your very, like short-term mission trips and things like that. So there is a culture, a barrier, 2 barriers being crossed. And then the third one is, this is the uttermost parts of the earth of Acts 1, verse 8, where you're going out to completely different language, completely different cultures, outside the cultural norms, outside a complete lifestyle change, the new language and everything. And this is what most foreign missionaries are going through. This is what Scott and Rebecca are about to do. The reason I show you this is there's different barriers that people have to go over to evangelize. And every time you cross a barrier, it gets more difficult. Is it more difficult to evangelize people outside the church building than people in the church building? Absolutely. So is it more difficult to evangelize people outside the church building in another culture, in another language? You see what I'm saying? We need to be mindful of these things, again, just to have a good mindset to be able to support our missionaries. I wish I had time to get into this, because this is another thing that Scott and Rebecca are going to be dealing with, is their strategy. I mentioned a little bit just a moment ago, and that being that they're going to go around to the different congregations in Italy to assess who needs the most help, what's going on, just to get a good idea of what's happening. And then they're going to give that information back to the elders here, and the elders and the deacon of missions and Scott and Rebecca will then make a decision along with the church of where they should go or what they should do. This is part of their strategy. Now, in their case, they don't have a strategy plan laid out line for line for line, a 5, 10, 20-year plan, but I guarantee you that Scott, wherever he goes, he's going to want to develop leaders within. He's going to evangelize, obviously, but then he's going to want to develop leaders within that congregation, help that congregation to get to be those 3 self things that we talk about, where they're self-governing, self-supporting, self-theologizing, I can never say that right, and self-propagating. That's the plan, essentially, is to make those kind of self- or autonomous congregations. Whew. A lot of information. I hope it was beneficial for you. The main point If you don't take anything else away from this, is hopefully you'll understand a little bit more about what we need to do to support our missionaries, Scott and Rebecca. We love you guys very much. We're really happy that you got your visa. And in just one more week, in fact, Scott will be preaching next Sunday, be his last Sunday here with us before they head out. Thanks for your attention. We're going to now prepare for worship.